Almost every relationship begins with a moment that feels unforgettable. Two people meet. Something about the interaction feels different from ordinary conversations. The attention feels stronger. The eye contact lasts slightly longer. The words seem more meaningful. And suddenly a strange emotional intensity begins forming between them. Messages feel exciting. Small interactions feel significant. Even simple moments carry emotional electricity. It feels as if something powerful has started. Something real. Something rare. And in those early days, many people quietly believe a comforting story. They believe the intensity they feel is proof of deep compatibility. Proof that this connection is different from everything that came before. Proof that this relationship might last. But time has a way of revealing something most people never expect. Weeks pass. Months pass. The emotional intensity slowly begins changing. Conversations feel slightly less thrilling. The urgency of attention begins fading. What once felt electric slowly becomes familiar. And sometimes people begin asking a painful question. Why did something that once felt so powerful begin losing its intensity? Was the love never real? Did the connection simply fade? Or did something deeper happen inside the psychology of the relationship? The answer is far more complex than most people realize. Because the intense beginning of a relationship is not only created by love. It is created by psychological chemistry, a combination of curiosity, novelty, uncertainty, and emotional discovery. And the human brain responds extremely strongly to these experiences. But the same psychological forces that create powerful beginnings also explain why intensity slowly fades. Understanding this process requires looking beyond romantic stories and into the deeper mechanisms of human attraction. Because relationships are not only emotional experiences. They are psychological systems, and every psychological system changes over time. The first stage of most relationships is driven by one powerful psychological force: novelty. Novelty simply means encountering something new. But inside the brain, novelty produces a very specific neurological response. When we encounter a new person who excites our curiosity, the brain releases dopamine. Dopamine is often described as the chemical of pleasure, but its real function is slightly different. Dopamine fuels anticipation, creates the feeling that something exciting might happen, and anticipation intensifies emotional experiences. This is why the early stage of relationships feels so powerful. Everything feels new. Every conversation reveals something previously unknown. Every message contains emotional potential. The mind becomes fascinated with discovery. What are they like? What do they think? How similar are we? What will happen next? These questions keep the brain engaged. The person becomes mentally stimulating because there is so much left to learn. Each interaction adds new information, and new information keeps the reward system active. This is why the beginning of relationships often feels addictive. The brain is experiencing repeated cycles of anticipation and emotional reward. But novelty has a natural limitation. Eventually, the unknown becomes known. Conversations that once felt surprising begin feeling predictable. Patterns of behavior become familiar. The mystery slowly decreases. And when novelty decreases, dopamine activity begins decreasing as well. This does not mean attraction disappears, but the emotional intensity created by novelty begins softening. The brain transitions from exploration mode into familiarity mode, and familiarity creates comfort. Comfort can build strong relationships, but comfort does not always feel as thrilling as novelty, which is why many people interpret this transition as the relationship losing its spark. In reality, the relationship is simply moving into a different psychological stage. But novelty is not the only force responsible for early relationship intensity. Another powerful psychological factor exists, and it is often even stronger than novelty. In the early stage of relationships, emotions are rarely predictable. One moment there is excitement, another moment there is uncertainty. Does the other person feel the same way? Are they thinking about me? Will they respond to my message? Do they miss me when I am not around? These small uncertainties create emotional tension, and emotional tension increases attention. The brain becomes highly alert to signals from the other person. Even small gestures feel meaningful. A delayed reply creates curiosity. Compliment creates excitement. A moment of affection feels powerful, because uncertainty amplifies emotional reactions. The brain treats uncertain rewards as more stimulating than predictable rewards. This is the same principle that makes games addictive. Not every attempt produces a reward, but when reward appears unpredictably, the brain becomes more motivated to continue engaging. In relationships, uncertainty produces similar emotional cycles. Distance creates anticipation, connection creates reward, and the alternating rhythm between the two keeps the mind emotionally invested. But as the relationship stabilizes, uncertainty naturally decreases. People begin understanding each other's habits. Communication becomes predictable. Emotional signals become easier to interpret. And once the brain no longer needs to analyze the situation constantly, the emotional intensity naturally softens. This transition is often misinterpreted as fading attraction. But psychologically, it is simply the mind adjusting to familiarity. And this adjustment is necessary for long-term relationships to survive, because constant emotional intensity is exhausting for the brain. But the human mind often confuses intensity with love, which leads many people to believe that when intensity fades, the relationship itself is failing. In reality, something deeper is happening. The relationship is moving from chemical attraction into emotional structure. And emotional structure requires different psychological qualities: trust, respect, stability, shared experience. These qualities develop more slowly, but they create deeper connections than novelty alone. Still, many people never reach this stage, because they become attached to the emotional excitement of the beginning. And when the excitement fades, they assume the relationship has lost its meaning. But the truth is more complicated, because the fading of intensity is not always the end of attraction. Sometimes it is the beginning of something more stable, but sometimes it reveals something else entirely. that the relationship was driven mostly by emotional chemistry rather than true compatibility. And this difference becomes clearer as the relationship evolves. One of the biggest misunderstandings about relationships comes from a simple belief. People assume that the emotional intensity they feel at the beginning is supposed to last forever. When that intensity begins fading, they believe something is wrong. They believe the love is disappearing. But psychology tells a very different story. The intense emotional stage at the beginning of relationships is actually designed to be temporary. It exists to bring two people together, not to sustain the entire relationship. Because the early stage of attraction activates a powerful neurochemical cocktail inside the brain. Dopamine, oxytocin, adrenaline, serotonin shifts. These chemicals heighten emotional perception. They amplify attention. They create excitement and anticipation. They make the other person feel unusually important. But the brain cannot remain in this heightened state forever. Constant emotional stimulation would exhaust the nervous system. So over time, the brain begins regulating itself. It reduces the chemical intensity. The relationship slowly moves from dopamine-driven excitement toward oxytocin-driven bonding. And these two emotional experiences feel very different. Dopamine creates thrill. Oxytocin creates calm connection. But many people misinterpret this calmness. Because calm connection does not feel as dramatic as early attraction. The emotional fireworks fade. The nervous excitement softens. The relationship begins feeling stable instead of thrilling. And stability is often misunderstood as boredom. But stability is actually the foundation of long-term attachment. The brain is shifting from exploration mode into bonding mode. And bonding mode requires a different emotional atmosphere. One that feels safe rather than stimulating. But here is where many relationships struggle. Because some people unconsciously crave the emotional intensity of the early stage. They become addicted to novelty, to the emotional roller coaster of discovery. When that excitement fades, they believe the relationship itself has lost value. In reality, the relationship may simply be entering its next psychological phase. But if both people do not understand this transition, confusion begins appearing. One partner may feel comfortable. The other may feel restless. One may interpret calmness as emotional security. The other may interpret it as emotional distance. And slowly a subtle emotional gap begins forming. Familiarity creates comfort, but familiarity also reduces psychological excitement. This is known as the familiarity paradox. The more we know someone, the safer the relationship feels, but the less mysterious they become. And mystery is a powerful ingredient of attraction. At the beginning of relationships, everything feels slightly unknown. Every conversation reveals new layers. Every meeting contains emotional discovery. But as familiarity increases, those discoveries slow down. The brain begins predicting the other person's behavior. Conversations become easier to anticipate. And predictability reduces emotional tension. Without emotional tension, the brain experiences fewer dopamine spikes, which means the relationship begins feeling calmer. But calm does not necessarily mean weaker. It simply means the relationship has moved beyond psychological novelty. The question then becomes, what replaces novelty? This is where mature relationships begin differentiating themselves from temporary connections. Because when novelty fades, deeper forms of connection must take its place. Shared values, mutual respect, emotional support, meaningful experiences built together over time. These elements build something more durable than early excitement, but they develop slowly, and in a culture that celebrates intense feelings, many people overlook their importance. They chase the feeling of early attraction again and again, not realizing that what they are chasing is simply the brain's reaction to novelty. And novelty always fades, no matter how strong the initial attraction felt. Which means the real challenge in relationships is not creating attraction. It is transforming attraction into something sustainable. But that transformation requires emotional awareness. Both people must understand that relationships naturally evolve. The early stage is not the final form. It is only the beginning. And if both partners expect the relationship to feel the same forever, disappointment eventually appears. Because the brain cannot maintain the chemistry of first attraction indefinitely. But relationships that successfully adapt to this transition often become stronger, because they are no longer driven only by chemistry. They are supported by emotional understanding. And emotional understanding is far more stable than excitement. As relationships move beyond the early stage of attraction, something subtle begins changing inside the psychological environment between two people. The mystery that once surrounded the connection slowly dissolves. The unknown becomes known. The emotional questions that once filled the mind gradually find their answers. And while this process creates stability, it also changes the way the brain experiences desire. Because desire is strongly connected to psychological distance. When two people first meet, there is distance between them. Not only physical distance, but emotional distance. They are still discovering each other, learning each other, trying to understand what the other person truly feels. And that emotional distance creates a sense of movement. A sense that something is unfolding, something that could grow deeper, something that could reveal something unexpected. But once two people become extremely familiar with each other, that emotional distance often disappears. They know each other's habits. They know each other's reactions. They know how conversations will probably unfold. And when the brain begins predicting the other person too easily, something interesting happens. Attention slowly decreases, not because the person is less valuable, but because the brain is no longer stimulated by discovery. The human mind is naturally curious. It thrives on novelty and learning. When that learning slows down, emotional stimulation also slows down. And relationships that once felt full of psychological discovery begin feeling routine. Routine itself is not negative. In fact, routine creates emotional security. But routine also reduces the sense of anticipation that fuels early attraction. And anticipation is one of the most powerful psychological ingredients behind desire. When we anticipate something, the brain activates its reward system. It prepares us for something meaningful that might happen. But when experiences become predictable, anticipation fades. The brain no longer prepares for surprise. It simply expects repetition. And repetition slowly softens emotional intensity. This is why relationships sometimes feel different after months or years together. Not because the connection disappeared, but because the psychological environment changed. The relationship moved from exploration to familiarity. But familiarity creates another challenge. It changes the way partners see each other. At the beginning of relationships, people tend to focus on each other's most attractive qualities. They are curious. They are attentive. They are emotionally present. But over time, familiarity reveals the entire human being. Strengths and weaknesses, positive habits and frustrating behaviors. And once this complete picture becomes visible, attraction sometimes becomes more complicated. Because the brain no longer sees only possibility. It sees reality. And reality includes imperfections. If the relationship is built on deep emotional respect, this stage strengthens the bond. But if the relationship relied mainly on early emotional chemistry, this stage can weaken the connection. Because chemistry thrives on imagination. But long-term relationships must survive reality. And reality requires emotional maturity. Another reason relationships sometimes fade over time is simple but powerful. People stop investing the same emotional effort they invested at the beginning. At the beginning of relationships, people are naturally attentive. They listen carefully. They respond thoughtfully. They express interest. They make time for connection. These behaviors strengthen attraction. But as familiarity increases, many people unconsciously relax these efforts. They assume the relationship is secure. So the small gestures that once created emotional closeness slowly disappear. Messages become shorter. Conversations become routine. Moments of attention become less frequent. And over time, the emotional atmosphere of the relationship begins changing. Not dramatically, but gradually, until both people begin feeling that something is different. Something that once felt alive now feels ordinary. This does not mean the relationship is doomed, but it means the relationship is entering a stage where conscious effort becomes important. Because emotional connection is not maintained by chemistry alone. It requires attention, presence, intentional care. Without these elements, familiarity slowly transforms into emotional distance. And emotional distance can quietly weaken attraction. One final factor explains why early relationships feel so intense compared to later stages. At the beginning, both people are seeing an idealized version of each other. Not intentionally, but naturally, because early attraction focuses attention on positive traits. The brain highlights qualities that feel exciting or attractive. Small imperfections are overlooked, but over time, reality becomes clearer. Both people reveal their authentic personalities, and authenticity sometimes feels less magical than imagination, but it is far more real. The early stage of attraction is like a bright spark, beautiful, intense, but temporary. Long-term relationships require something stronger than sparks. They require emotional understanding, respect, trust, and the ability to grow together as two evolving individuals. Without these deeper qualities, the fading of early intensity can feel like the end of love. But when those qualities exist, the fading of intensity becomes something different. It becomes the transition from romantic excitement into emotional partnership. An emotional partnership may not always feel dramatic, but it creates something far more meaningful: stability, understanding, and a connection that can survive the passing of time. At this point, something important becomes clear. The fading of intensity is not always the end of attraction. It is simply the end of automatic attraction. In the early stage of relationships, attraction happens naturally. The brain is stimulated by novelty. Curiosity fuels attention. Uncertainty creates emotional tension. Everything feels spontaneous. But long-term attraction works differently. It becomes something that must be created intentionally, because the psychological conditions that produced the early spark eventually disappear. Mystery becomes familiarity. Anticipation becomes routine. And emotional discovery slows down. But some couples manage to maintain attraction for many years. Not because they keep the exact same intensity as the beginning, but because they learn something many people never understand. They learn how to recreate psychological curiosity inside familiarity. This means continuing to see each other as evolving individuals rather than finished personalities. Because people are not static. They grow. They change. They develop new interests, new perspectives, new emotional layers. But many relationships stop noticing this evolution. Partners begin seeing each other as fixed characters. They assume they already know everything about each other. And when curiosity disappears, attention slowly fades. But couples who maintain curiosity continue discovering new dimensions of each other. They ask questions. They share thoughts. They remain mentally interested in each other's inner world. And that curiosity keeps the psychological connection alive. Another important factor is emotional autonomy. When two people become completely dependent on each other for emotional fulfillment, the relationship sometimes begins feeling heavy. Attraction thrives in environments where both individuals maintain a sense of personal identity, where both partners still have their own interests, passions, and perspectives, because personal growth creates new experiences. And new experiences bring novelty back into the relationship. But when both people stop growing individually, the relationship becomes stagnant. It becomes repetitive, and repetition slowly weakens emotional excitement. So paradoxically, the healthiest relationships are not the ones where two people merge into a single identity. They are the ones where two independent individuals continue evolving while remaining emotionally connected. That balance keeps the relationship dynamic. Another powerful element is emotional attention. At the beginning of relationships, people naturally focus on each other. They notice small details. They listen carefully. They express appreciation. But as time passes, many couples stop practicing this level of attention. They assume the connection is secure, so they stop nurturing it. But attention is the oxygen of relationships. Without attention, emotional distance slowly appears. Not because love disappeared, but because it stopped being expressed. Couples who maintain attraction understand something simple yet powerful. They treat emotional connection as something that must be continuously cultivated. Small gestures, meaningful conversations, moments of presence. These simple actions renew the emotional energy of the relationship. And slowly the spark that once appeared naturally becomes something both partners actively protect. Because attraction that survives time is not only chemistry. It is awareness, it is understanding, and it is the decision to keep choosing each other even after the novelty fades. So when a relationship begins feeling less intense than it once did, the question is not always whether love disappeared. The deeper question is whether the relationship moved beyond its first stage. Because the beginning of love is often driven by chemistry, but the continuation of love is driven by consciousness, by the willingness to remain curious, by the effort to remain emotionally present, by the choice to grow together rather than simply coexist. And the truth most people never realize is this: the fading of intensity does not always mean the connection is dying. Sometimes it means the relationship has reached the point where real love can finally begin. Because real love is quieter than excitement, but far stronger than temporary sparks. And when two people understand this difference, their connection stops depending on the emotional fireworks of the beginning. Instead, it becomes something deeper, something steady, something capable of surviving the passing of time. And if this insight changed the way you see relationships today, then take a moment now and subscribe to the channel. Because here on Voxlore Audio, we explore the deeper psychology behind human behavior, attraction, and the hidden patterns shaping modern relationships. And the more clearly you understand those patterns, the more consciously you begin living them.